So, John,
Hello.
thank you so much for agreeing to chat for the benefit of all my followers. Can I begin by asking you, how did you become a phonetician?
I suppose I was always interested in languages, and at Cambridge I'd read classics, but we had to choose in our third year various options, one of which was language, which I did, and a course on offer was phonetics, taught by John Trim.
Oh, John Trim, right.
Who'd just arrived from UCL at that time, where he'd been previously. And I went to that course and enjoyed it greatly, and when I graduated, he recommended me to his friend or his colleague Gimson in London. So I came to London and was interviewed by Gimson and Fry and admitted and did a master's in London.
At the time, was it still just the Department of Phonetics, or was it already Phonetics and Linguistics?
It was just phonetics then. There was a separate Department of Linguistics run by Halliday, which started shortly afterwards.
M.A.K. Halliday.
Yeah. By the time I did my PhD, I think it was already called Phonetics and Linguistics.
I think you told me once that you'd already become interested in phonetics as a teenager.
Well, local public library, I found and read Jones's Outline of English Phonetics, and found it very interesting, and noticed, amongst other things, that the way he described the articulation of the R sound didn't seem to quite agree with what I did. And I think I do it in what's now known as a bunched way, with the back of the tongue rather than the tongue tip.
So, really?
Really?
Yeah, I think I noticed that in your speech quite early on. Yes. And what was your master's on?
I measured formants, the formants of RP vowels, really.
Yeah, and that was certainly being cited for an awful long time, because so few people go to the trouble of doing these measurements.
Yeah.
So I think it's fascinating. It'll be fascinating for people to hear that you sort of began your research with acoustic phonetics.
Well, that's right, because I was sort of told I really got to get to grips with instrumental phonetics, although I wasn't really terribly interested in it, so I thought, well, I'll give it a go, and with the help of Adrian Forson, who taught me that.
He taught me experimental phonetics when I was an undergraduate.
Yeah.
What memories do you have of Gimson, A.C. Gimson?
Well, I remember he was very amused to be described as a burly phonetician.
Burly?
Burly, yes.
Who described him as burly?
Oh, it was some journalist who'd interviewed him, you know.
Burly.
He used to have a regular radio programme, you know, he used to be on...
Probably the Home Service back then, was it? Yes.
It was probably the Home Service, yes. Doing little, 3 or 4 minute things about words of interest and how they were pronounced.
I remember him being very friendly and approachable.
Oh, he was, yes.
As a little undergraduate, he knew me by my first name and was happy to answer questions. I think temperamentally he seems to have been quite different from Jones.
I think that's true, yes.
Yeah.
And of course, he was always good fun doing air training with. I used to do air training with Gim and also with O'Connor and Arnold. So
already at the time you joined the department, Gimson had restarted the summer course in English phonetics, the vacation course.
He had, yes, that's right, yes.
So what was that like at the time?
Well, it was very French-oriented. Almost everybody on it was French.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Jones was always involved in French.
Well, that's right. He had a French wife. And his wife wasn't she the daughter of Paul Passy?
Passy, I believe so, yes. And, of course, the Journal of the IPA.
Yeah, the Journal of the IPA was called Le Maître Phonétique.
Le Maître Phonétique, yes. Yeah.
And, of course, it was in transcription entirely, and it was in French. So in order to read it, you had to be able to know French and also know how French was pronounced.
Yes.
Fortunately, I managed.
I'm sure you did. One thing that crossed my mind recently, I'm making a video about the vowel space again. It's something that I'm quite obsessed with.
Yeah.
And listening to Jones's demonstration of the cardinal vowels, the one that always puzzles me is 6.
Yeah.
Which nobody seems to do the way Jones did it. It strikes me as being not very back, quite centralised. And my pet theory was that he had French in mind.
Yeah, indeed. Because in French that vowel is somewhat centralised.
Yes. can be very centralised, I think.
C'est bon.
Yeah. So the summer course, SCEP as we call it, Summer Course in English Phonetics, which of course I'm the director of now.
Indeed.
There was Gimson, then Jones, then Gimson, then yourself,
Yeah.
then Michael Ashby, and now me.
It goes round and round, yeah.
Well, I always think it's a bit like Doctor Who, regenerates every so often. What do you think its merits are?
Well, there are a lot of people in the world who want to learn English, and it's in everybody's interest that they pronounce it as well as being able to read and write. So it fulfills the need, really.
I always think the unique selling point of the summer course is that people get detailed feedback on their pronunciation of English or of
yes, and that it covers intonation as well as articulation.
Yes, intonation, yes.
Yes.
Am I right that you met Daniel Jones?
Yes, you are. Because when I was first appointed, he was elderly and living in retirement in Gerrard's Cross, but he expressed an interest in meeting me since I was going to be an assistant lecturer in the department. So I travelled out to meet him, and he was sort of a bit of a shrivelled old man with an electric fire by him. But he said, "Oh, come in, Wells, sit down, would you, and read to me from this." And that was Hindi in transcription.
So the moment you arrived, you had to sit down and read
And prove that I could do it, yes.
from a fairly narrow transcription, I imagine.
Well, yes, but the main thing is, could I control the difference between dental and retroflex plosives, for example, and nasals, and produce good monophthongs, A and O, and so on. So I did that, and I think I passed the test.
And so what was he like?
Well, that's difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, we had a chat about his EPD because I'd got various things I wanted to say about it, and I said them to him, and we chatted about it.
What did you have to tell him about EPD?
Well, I suppose several things. First of all, that it ought to cover a wider range of accents, and in due course, of course, it was extended so that it covered American English as well.
But that was after Jones's time.
That was, yes. And I suppose there were various odd words that I had observations on. I seem to remember that the word circumstance or circumstance or circumstance, I reckoned it ought to have all three variants.
So when time came around and you were doing your own dictionary, you decided you were definitely going to put lots of variation in.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So how did that come about? How did you come to be a dictionary maker?
Longman had a lexicography sort of group which met to discuss Longman's dictionaries. There was Della Summers who used to organise that, and I was talking to Della about what I saw as the shortcomings of EPD, and so she said, "Well, why don't we get you to write another one, a better one?" So I said, "Okay," and I did.
Did you hesitate at all? Because it's a daunting job.
Well, I wouldn't say I hesitated because it interested me, you know. It was something I had great fun with, really. You know, I enjoyed it. I've always liked dictionary making, and I've made other dictionaries, you know.
So how much time did it take? Were you spending hours a day on it, week in, week out?
I suppose so. I mean, I once compared it to a marathon. You start off confidently and you then just keep going doggedly until you finish, and then it's done.
And you've run a marathon?
6 marathons in my life.
6?
Yeah. The London 5 times and the Berlin once.
One of my patrons, Nicolas, asked if you were to do a 4th edition of the Longman Pronunciation Dictionary, what do you think you might change?
Oh, it's not difficult. I'm not going to do a 4th edition, so there's no danger of that. I don't really need to think about it.
So there's nothing in particular that you thought to yourself, oh, perhaps I would do that differently?
Well, possibly the notation of the O vowel might be different, you know, so that instead of a schwa and an O, it could be an and as in nurse, but without the length most and an O. But that's really a notational triviality.
Right, and why would you make that change?
Because people are confused by the use of a schwa, which they think of as being a weak vowel, an unstressed vowel. They're surprised to see it indicated with stress.
Yeah, but I think people now think of that number 3 symbol, the reverse epsilon, as an opener vowel. It's been revised, and there's a symbol for a closer schwa, etc. I think you did a blog post once saying that you thought there were rather too many central vowels on the IPA diagram.
I think there's no need really for much beyond a sort of mid-central one and a rather opener one. I mean, the contrast we have to be able to cater for is the German difference between bitte, meaning please, and bitter, meaning bitter.
So for the more open schwa, you'd use the rotated upside-down A.
Yeah.
How did you decide where to mark post-tonic secondary stress?
Well, it's on compounds, isn't it?
Compounds,
Yeah.
but some other places like ism.
Yeah, well, you can argue that ism words do have a compound-like status, you know, because you have the base form, you have organ, and then you have organism, just like organ prelude, or perhaps, yeah.
When I began to work on the online Cube dictionary, which I co-edit, I mean, that's really what made me respect your work on LPD, because there are so many decisions you have to make, and they're so difficult.
Indeed, yeah.
And word frequency seems to play
It
a
does.
major role all the time.
Yeah.
One of the things that people are fascinated by is the Wells lexical sets.
Yes.
So how did you come up with the Wells lexical sets?
I think I was probably in bed at the time. But it suddenly occurred to me that this was a good way to operate, to describe vowels, because previous efforts, notably by Weinreich in America, really had struck me as being pretty ludicrous. I think he had sort of numbered vowels, and they weren't in sets, so my innovation was putting them into sets.
But how did you choose the keywords?
Oh, I chose them so that as far as possible they couldn't be confused with anything else, so that when you say one word, if you say trap, for example, there's no word trep, and there's no word trop, and no word trop, which you might get confused with. So each word was chosen as far as possible to be unconfusable.
And what about the phonetic form of the words you chose? So some of them end in S, don't they? Like
Yes.
fleece and face and price and choice.
I tried to get them ending with a voiceless consonant, because that keeps them fairly short and removes the problems arising from differences of length. Yeah.
The co-editor of the Cube Dictionary, Peter Sigetvari, he was wondering why you didn't use fierce and scarce instead of near and square.
Well, yes, maybe I should have done, but I didn't. And what are we going to use for in that case? There's no word ending in
Urs.
urs.
Yeah.
Yurt is some kind of a Mongolian dwelling, I believe. But people don't know that.
Of course, like word frequency, also the status of words as native or exotic.
Indeed,
You have a different phonology for them, really, don't you? If you were going to change or augment the keywords, the lexical sets, how would you go about doing that? Have you given any thought to that?
Well, no, because I'm not going to. But I think if you read the Wikipedia article on lexical sets, there are a number of proposals there that other people have made.
Yes. I find that cure is a tricky one. Because, I mean, of course, my native accent doesn't have but increasingly I think people in southern Britain are like me in using the north vowel there.
Yes. Well, I too can say cure or cure.
Oh, really?
Yes.
In fact, I think going back to early editions of EPD, I think north was an option in those words, or most of them.
Yeah.
Not all, I think. Maybe not good.
But pure, certainly.
Yes. You talk about the foot strut split, but the word foot in a sense didn't have the foot vowel.
Well, I could have said put and cut, but there's a problem that those words are easily confused with other words. Cutter gets confused with cat, and put gets confused with port or with
Pot.
Pot, yeah.
Yeah. So did it take you a long time to come up with the lexical sets and the keywords? Because I think you once told me you did it in a weekend.
I certainly didn't anguish over it for ages and ages, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Another one of my patrons called Mike is curious to know if there's anything that you've noticed in recent developments in English that has struck you as particularly interesting, or something that you'd like to take into account in a new dictionary if you did one.
Well, I find that difficult to answer, to be honest. There's nothing that immediately springs to mind.
One thing that I really skirted around was L vocalisation,
Yeah.
because it means a radical change to the vowel system.
It does, yes, yes.
Yeah.
And, of course, there are these things that follow from it. You lose a lot of contrasts, as you mentioned.
I remember you explaining to me a long time ago pronunciations that you heard on the railway, like Earlsfield.
Earlsfield, yes.
So you get a neutralisation of weld, W-E-L-D, and world.
Indeed. We're talking about world, W-O-R-L-D, not world around.
Oh, yes, that's a good point. Would they pronounce that verb as well? I don't know. Yeah. I have to ask.
Yeah, indeed.
And if it becomes a majority thing, or as the word you used to use, mainstream, if L vocalisation becomes mainstream, really the descriptions will have to change.
Yes. Feel and fill become homophonous as feel, but the feeling and filling remain distinct.
Yes, yes. I think another of your blog articles was rather dismissive about the change people talk about from pronouncing words like train and drain with an initial t and d to beginning with ch, r and j, r. And I put a survey on my website and asked people to say, what do you think these sounds are?
Think?
A majority of people below 40 say that words like train and drain begin with ch and j.
Well, I think that's a reasonable point of view. I noticed that in Jamaica, you know, they've got this now way of writing Jamaican, and the words of this type, they do write them now with JR and CHR. If you look at Professor Devonish's website about Jamaican Creole, you can see that that's what it gives for their new orthography.
That's exactly what a majority of younger speakers, and throughout the English-speaking world, as far as I can tell, I had respondents on my survey from Britain, Australia, America.
You have to think about minimal pairs or possible minimal pairs like century, guard versus century, 100 years, which may or may not be identical.
Yes.
Century.
Well, depending, I guess, on syncope.
Yeah.
A phonetician I know called Adrian told me that as a child he was always baffled as to why he had to write his name with a D. Because as far as he was concerned, it was Adrian.
I always wondered why it was like my name, Adrian, it had a j sound in it. It was spelled with a D.
Yeah. And I think parents are increasingly noticing spelling mistakes with CH, like writing train with a ch with CH at the beginning.
Maybe we ought to change our orthography.
Possibly. I remember I was quite nervous showing you the manuscript of my book, English After RP. Yes, I was really quite nervous showing it to you and to Peter Roach, as you know, the editors of these major dictionaries.
But I thought it was very good.
Well, thank you very much. I was very relieved. Throughout Accents of English, when you show phonemic vowel systems, you always group fleece and goose with the closing diphthongs and not with the long monophthongs. So in the transcription system I use in my book, I try to make that explicit by showing fleece and goose as being narrow diphthongs, but nonetheless that belong in those sets. What did you think about my proposal to do that?
I think that's absolutely okay. Because if you take a word like three, we do typically say three rather than three, unless we're Scots.
Yes. And of course, I think the monophthongal nature of fleece and goose in Scotland is related to the fact that face and goat are also monophthongs. It seems to me that in many accents, fleece and face pattern together and goose and goat pattern together.
Yes.
Either both diphthongs, both monophthongs, or whatever.
Seems reasonable, yeah.
Yeah. I called my book English After RP. I don't know, did you think that was too provocative? I mean, my view was that it perhaps we've reached a point where it's worth keeping the term RP for a former standard.
Well, it's reasonable, yes. There's always a question of what to name son of RP, if we could call it that. Southern British Standard, people have called it, but really that's not very good because British is too wide, Southern is too narrow, and Standard is questionable.
Why is Southern too narrow?
Well, because it depends what you think of as the south of England. And as a native northerner, like you, I rather resent being called Southern.
I've always thought that Southern British Standard or Standard Southern British, you could put the words in any order really, is benignly ambiguous. So that if you wish, you can use the word Southern simply to exclude Scotland.
Right, that's true, yes, you could. Yes, I mean, there was a time when Scotland was called North Britain and England and Wales was called South Britain.
I think it's a little bit like General American. I mean, there are people who say, "Oh, General American has the court distinction," but it seems to me far more sensible to say that there are two varieties of General American: one that makes the distinction, one that doesn't.
Yes, one on one side of the Mississippi, the other on the other side of the Mississippi.
Especially since a majority of Americans now have the merger, it makes sense to say they're just different varieties of General American.
I think it's true. Yeah.
Speaking of accents of English, how did the 3-volume Accents of English come about?
Well, it started off as a single book. When Cambridge University Press saw the manuscript, they said, "Oh, we ought to divide it into 3 separate books." And so that's what we did.
When you embarked on it, do you think there was less interest in diverse accents than there is now, or than there became because of your book?
Very possibly so, yes. I mean, there have been rather few attempts to follow it up with similar works. Hickey is the most recent one, I think, and Trudgill and...
Hughes, Trudgill and Watt.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Also.
Very good, yes.
Yeah. I met Peter Trudgill when I gave him a lift. We'd both been to a conference about English in Newcastle, I think. Barbara Strang was the professor of English there, and I'd driven up, so I gave Pete a lift back. From then on we knew one another, yeah.
So Accents of English was divided into 3 volumes after you'd finished it?
Yes.
Okay. How long did it take to write?
I really don't remember. I can remember I had an electric typewriter, which was unusual for the time, but that's what I used, I think, to write it.
With a phonetic, IBM phonetic ball,
yeah.
Do you have any regrets about Accents of English in terms of perhaps accents that you wish you'd been able to cover more?
Well, I suppose, yes. Various islands are not well covered. What have I got about Mauritius, for example? Nothing, you know. And the Falklands and places where people do speak English, you know, and even Malaysia, you know, and Singapore and so on.
Did you read about the so-called Antarctic accent?
No.
There's been some research to show that people staying in this research facility in the Antarctic, with I think particularly the goat vowel.
Right.
Some of them were native speakers, some non-native speakers, and they all converged on some vowel that none of them had started with.
Right. The next thing will be a space vowel then.
Yes. Yes, possibly. Yes, influenced by zero gravity, who knows? So, Esperanto. How and why did you first take an interest in Esperanto?
Well, I was cycling back to school. We lived at that time in Derbyshire, and my school was in Surrey, and I decided to cycle there over 2 or 3 days, you know.
From Derbyshire to Surrey?
Yes. And so I stayed overnight in a youth hostel, and the warden of the youth hostel was interested in Esperanto, and he had some booklets there, and I purchased one. I think it was 6pence from him, and when I stopped for lunch on the next day, I started reading it as I lay down by the roadside, munching my sandwich. And when I got back down to school, then I went through it carefully, and I got hold of a proper textbook and taught myself. And not very long after that, I started being able to tune into the radio and listen to broadcasts in Esperanto from Switzerland. And in due course, I made contact with other speakers in Britain around the place.
What was the appeal?
Well, it seemed like a good idea, you know, so that people can understand one another. And I've always been interested in languages, as you know, so...
So what future do you see for Esperanto, perhaps with English being such a world language now?
Indeed, it's very difficult to say. I mean, in a sense, it has already succeeded, in as much as there are lots of people who've made friends or contacts of other kinds with people from other languages, other countries. There are children who have been born to families where Esperanto is the family language, and they're therefore native speakers of it. And I know 2 or 3 such people.
So it's as worthy of study and learning as any other language?
Well, certainly from a sociolinguistic point of view, yes.
You started an incredibly popular blog. Many people have expressed regrets that it isn't maintained. So how did you come to start your blog?
Well, it was when I retired from work, and of course at work I'd always had the students to bounce ideas off, and when I left I hadn't anybody to bounce ideas off anymore, so I thought, oh, I'd better try do it online. So that's why I started, and I did a blog entry, I think every day, was it?
I think it was every day, yes. So did you enjoy blogging? Did it do what you wanted to do in terms of staying in touch?
Oh yes, it did, because it got feedback from people, you know.
And also a couple of books.
Well, yes, then I turned it into sound interesting and sounds fascinating, that's right.
But so you can't be persuaded to restart the blog?
No, I can't. I'm retired, I'm elderly. I'm in my late 80s, for goodness sake.
One of the things people talk about an awful lot at the moment is AI, and you know whether that's going to affect people's interest in language learning. Have you given any thought to this?
I haven't really. I can't see that people are going to stop wanting to learn other languages, because it's human contact, which is, of course, much more important really to us than artificial intelligent contact.
The thing that I've always liked about the summer course is the way that it brings people together, which is something that languages do. You mentioned this with Esperanto,
yes,
etc.
Yeah.
There's always been a very nice international, friendly atmosphere.
Yes. Yes, I've always been terribly grateful to my parents, who, when I was 18, arranged an exchange so that I went and stayed with a German family, you know, for 5 or 6 weeks, and came back, of course, speaking reasonable German, although I hadn't done German at school. And that's nice to be able to do. And
so you didn't know any German when you went?
No. I mean, I had a Hugo's German in 3 months book or something, which I'd looked at, but that's all I knew when I got there. And I remember the only thing I could say when I was there, first arrived, was, "Ich bin müde." I'm tired. Which I was.
That reminds me of Japan and the Japanese always saying, "Oh, you must be very tired," which I remember to begin with I found quite insulting. Until I discovered that it was a standard expression. Well, thank you very much. It's been fascinating talking to you.
Pleasure.
I'm sure everyone's going to be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Have fun editing.
Yes, I'll do my best.